Hello, everyone. I'm Dee Dee Petri, President and CEO of the Olmsted Network, and we are delighted to welcome you this evening to the first of many programs in 2024. We tend to think of the Olmsteds working on the East Coast, but tonight we go west. The Olmsted Brothers Western Frontier Semi-Arid Design for California. We are delighted to be led on this journey by Dr. Christine Edstrom O'Hara. She is a former trustee, advisor, and now member of the Olmsted Network Scholars Council. She is going to help us understand the Olmsted brothers' work in the West, their take on regional ecology, and to look more broadly at their efforts. I think it's also interesting to note that they actually opened up a Western office in October of 1922. So with that, we're going to turn it over to Dr. O'Hara. She is a professor of landscape architecture at Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo, and she will talk with a PowerPoint for about 40 minutes. After that, we will open to Q&A. So if you have questions, please put those into the Q&A box in the course of her presentation. I also need to put in a brief advertisement. In June 2024, this year, California Eden, Heritage Landscapes of the Golden State will come out, edited by Dr. Edstrom O'Hara, and we look forward to giving you more information about this publication closer to the published date. So with that, Christy, welcome. We're delighted to have you today.
Thank you so much, and thank you, everyone. Good evening. I titled this lecture using the word Western frontier, perhaps not like the typical definition, but rather considering frontier as this definition of stretching the limits of understanding. For the Olmsted brothers, in many ways, they'd have to rethink their approach to design in California and develop projects that could manage for both water inundation and drought in the semi-arid climate. For Southern California, that meant regular drought conditions and often regular flooding. So the projects were always about water. In his 1954 essay called The Landscape of Beauty and Meaning, Frederick Olmsted Jr. poetically wrote about the beauty of Point Lobos Reserve along California's scenic northern coast. The site preservation as a state park is part of Frederick Olmsted Jr.'s legacy in California. He understood the balance of landscape scenery with environmental planning to preserve places like this one that you see on the screen, a really powerful and dramatic beauty. In his essay, he writes about this constant competition between species of all types, including plants, animals, and ultimately humans, which form the basis of his design principles. And in a design and landscape architecture, in a discipline like that, it's necessarily interventionist, but his designs were guided by environmental principles, allowing him to design spaces for people to use and enjoy, while still trying to preserve that intrinsic beauty and splendor from those original settings. And this philosophy sets the tone for his approach to California. Olmsted's essay was grounded in my many years of living in the state, beginning in the 1920s. These green dots on the map represent Olmsted projects in the United States. And while, as Dee Dee said, most of the Olmsted brothers projects were developed from their Brookline, Massachusetts office, in 1922, the firm opened a West Coast office to manage their growing amount of work in the region. It was initially located in Redondo Beach, which is kind of southern Los Angeles County, and the office soon then moved to nearby Palos Verdes Estates. Sons John Charles and Frederick Olmsted Jr. had watched as their father, Frederick Olmsted Sr., really tested ideas of semi-arid design at places like Stanford University and Mountain View Cemetery, which is near Oakland, during the 19th century. His children, who founded the Olmsted Brothers firm, would continue that approach, but in projects arguably more complex during the 20th century. The landscape architects who would focus on California included John Charles until his early death in 1920, Frederick Olmsted Jr., Fred Dawson, and George Gibbs. From father to sons, the firm would share these values. One is that they would connect people to nature within the city. Secondly, that design would be regional, responding to the natural conditions of the site. And then thirdly, when possible, they would affect environmental restoration through the design. So the design would actually act as a way of doing some kind of an environmental restoration or solving an environmental problem with the way that they did the design. At the same time, there are many important changes between the 19th century when Frederick Olmsted Sr. was designing and the 20th century when the Olmsted brothers practiced. These include, when we look at this slide, the proliferation of the car. We've got new urban planning models, increased density in cities, and control of nature, from dams to rerouting rivers, such as we have for the Los Angeles Aqueduct. And all of these were things that the Olmsted brothers would need to address. Regionalism for the Olmsted brothers would not be a new approach for the firm, but California's climate was very challenging compared to work in other parts of the country where there was year-round precipitation. What's important to understand is the unusual climate of Southern California. It's Mediterranean, which is defined by typically 15 inches of annual rainfall, often a lot less, sometimes 6 inches of annual rainfall, with all of the rain coming in the winter. So there's no summer rain. This climate is only one of 5 in the world, such as Europe's Mediterranean basin, Western Chile, Western Australia, and South Africa. So in the summer in Southern California, landscapes are yellow and not green because the rainy season is over. The Olmsted brothers' first foray into design in California was a 1903 consultation for development of Catalina Island, which is off the coast of Los Angeles. And the challenge for this site was that it lacked fresh water. John Charles visited the site. His report reflected really this beautiful appreciation for the native landscape. And he was trying to figure out ways to reduce water use in the landscape. So beyond simply building reservoirs, he suggested rainwater collection captured from tanks that were in the ravines, and also using salt water for this island for sewer use. The ornamental pools that they wanted in the pleasure grounds could be filled with salt water that when the tidal flow came in would refill those basins. And then irrigation would be subsoil irrigation systems that would minimize evaporation in this warm, dry climate. So the climate forced the firm to be creative in solving issues of design without water. Catalina Island was only a consultation, though. The firm's largest community design began in 1914, in which they would continue as advisors until 1948. Initially 16,000 acres, Palos Verdes Estate was the largest new town designed in the 1920s. And it's located here where the arrow is in this southern part of Los Angeles County. In between, it's on the peninsula that's in between Redondo Beach and San Pedro. The region was not entirely new to them. They had developed other new towns nearby, such as Torrance, which we can see back in the background here, which was a town that Olmsted Jr. had worked on. This is the La Venta Inn, and it's the first building that was built in Palos Verdes. It's aptly the sales office. The developer was the New York banker Frank Vanderlip, and a partnership of buyers who purchased the property for its spectacular ocean view. It was one of the last large coastal areas in Los Angeles County that had not yet been developed. And then from the onset, the city was conceived as a totally planned community. They thought through every address, every place where they would build. The Olmsted brothers were the directors of design, along with the city planner, Charles Chaney, and the architect, Myron Hunt. Palos Verdes was developed too during a critical period of regionalism, when designers were asking, what should design look like in Southern California? And how does that design respond to the region? Typical for the Olmsted firm prior to any design was meticulous environmental research. In 1914, Fred Dawson contacted Los Angeles forecaster Dr. Ford Ashman Carpenter to compile climatological studies of Palos Verdes. Carpenter set up a series of stations throughout the 16,000 acres to record the weather through thermometers and rain gauges that would provide climate data, so the firm would know, whether they could use wind power, what are the exact precipitation rates, which are different on that peninsula because of the different light and aspect and wind. The topographical survey that we see on the left was developed with with a lot of precision, with the contour lines at 5-foot intervals, is what we can see. Remember, at this time, the firm was still designing the road system from Brookline, as they hadn't yet opened up the California office. And at this highly topographic site, they wanted to do the roads properly. Also in initial site research, they did exhaustive hydrology and microclimate studies. The firm contacted local horticultural experts, including Theodore Payne. He's an English expatriate who opened the first native plant nursery in Los Angeles, all California flora. Payne would advise them on plants that needed low amounts of water, both California natives, but also Mediterranean-based plants. Typical for all of their projects was the establishment of an on-site nursery to propagate plants that were suited to the region. Many of the plants were grown in conditions called dry farming, in which the only irrigation is through fog and rain. Realizing that most new residents of California would be unaware of the native and hardy plants to plant in Palos Verdes, home sites were often pre-planted with low water ornamental and fruit trees. Each designer and the developer of Palos Verdes had a specific agenda for what it would look like. Developer Frank Vanderlip envisioned an exclusive residential colony that was based on Mediterranean design that was responsive to the setting's Southern Italian ambience. It reminded him of his visits to the Amalfi Coast. Myron Hunt was the chief architect, and he really made a career of developing a distinct regional style. And what he called his design in Palos Verdes, California architecture. It was an eclectic mix of Italian, Moorish, Spanish, and Mexican designs. The city planner was Charles Chaney, and he used Mediterranean prototypes in the villages at Palos Verdes, but blended them with American planning models. Buildings would have a long stucco facade with arcades for shade, as we can see over here, with a U-shaped layout around the plaza. What's American, however, is that rather than it being a pedestrian plaza, as it would be in Europe, here those spaces were used for parking lots. For all the designers, the new city would be influenced by both the existing landscape and other Mediterranean elements of urban design, but with a 20th century cultural spin. Comparing this built design of Palos Verdes to the historic southern Italian town of Ravello, we can see a similar form of architecture with the red tile roofs and white buildings, but also the way the buildings densely hug the steep slopes. The streets are built in response to the topography, and plants are drought tolerant because of the lack of rain. Very unusual for the firm is that for the first time, not only were the Olmsted brothers the designer, but they're also community members as well. In a contractual agreement with developer Frank Vanderlip, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. and Fred Dawson were required to live in Palos Verdes while it was under construction. So through this residence, the firm was able to not only influence the community's tastes and control the long-term development of the city, but they also were able to combine their professional and personal values into this design. So the image we see here is Frederick Law Olmsted and his family's house that was overlooking the ocean. You see how early that development is in this photo. Here's the plan for the Olmsted residence in Palos Verdes, where Olmsted lived with his wife and his daughter. You entered the site through this long drive, and then you would pass by an orchard and a vegetable garden that was over here. If you were walking into the site, you would go through this long flower border that's similar in design to the style of the English landscape gardener Gertrude Jekyll. The planting design that we see here by the house is largely informal, filled in by drought-tolerant plants. And the Olmsted firm also sourced local materials such as Palos Verdes white flagstone. This is Frederick L. Olmsted inspecting the landscape of his house, touching his walls. And as the firm did throughout the development, they incorporated that Palos Verdes stone in walls and in stairs to link the design to the site. Open space played a really special role in the design, and it's an important aspect of the Olmsted brothers' work. The open space wasn't located in the typically undevelopable land, what's much more common, but instead the design utilized what would have otherwise been valuable hillside and shore lots. And they wanted it for multi-use. Much of the housing was located on the opposite side of the road, so that when people drove by, they would still have the open views of the ocean. Other large areas of open space were designed to divert stormwater into canyons. And so we can see the existing hydrology over here in the ravines that they were trying to maintain. Storm drains aren't found in the 1920s development of Palos Verdes because the lots and the streets were graded to divert stormwater into green space. So the reason that diversion into green space would also help mitigate for how heavy the winter rains are. That open space maintained the existing natural landscape as an amenity with the additional function of assisting drainage and stormwater recharge. So individual neighborhoods were beautifully nestled among these greenways, though most people would probably not realize their ecological function for water management. You can see all of these areas of green, which is where the stormwater would drain to. Not only was the Olmsted firm an expert in the ecology of the region, but as residents, they're also familiar with its culture. So critical to their plan was an understanding of the car culture of LA. It's the city that had the highest per capita number of cars in 1920. The image we see here is downtown Los Angeles before the invention of stoplights. So you can see the craziness of car culture, which still exists today. Palos Verdes' initial development of 16,000 acres was reduced to a design of 3,200 acres. And then the firm laid them out in 6 principal villages, each with its own commercial center and schools. And then there would be parkways in between the different villages that would then connect it into one larger green space. Some of the planning models that were used at Palos Verdes included very, very wide streets that were 200 feet wide. And this allowed for multiple options for circulation. You know, there was a place for cars. Initially, down the middle of this road was going to be an electric railway that would come out of Redondo Beach. So there would have been public access, plus pedestrians, and then you can see people, equestrians over here. So 4 types of circulation. The initial research that they had done on soils provided information about water permeability. So the street plans were designed to manage stormwater. And then the Olmsted firm added an additional erosion control measure through planting the native plants along the edges and here, where the plants would survive on simply annual rainfall. And in this image, we can see how the stormwater was collected here and rerouted, again, without storm drains. It's only in the area of Malaga Cove that was the one that was built out for the Olmsted plan that we don't see those storm drains because it is in the latter development of Palos Verdes. Of course, the planning for Palos Verdes also required dividing up the residential lots. So you can see the squiggly lines are that the roads are following topography like all Olmsted projects would, but the properties are laid out in all these very non-uniform sizes with the intention that each homeowner would develop their design in best response to their specific site. So in addition to the kind of requirements of building in Palos Verdes was that the footprint of the building could be no greater than 30% of the lot size. So much of the lot would still be landscape. The result of having those irregular lot layouts changed the house siting so that all the front doors, you know, wouldn't line up across the street. And it really adds character to the streetscape in doing this. And it's a very different way of designing than a gridded lot plan, which is more typical. Because of the steep grade of much of Palos Verdes, many of the original homes required terracing. Imagery from the 20s reflects these private homes using varying elevations as design features, with Palos Verdes stone covering the walls and the steps. Terracing also reduces erosion during heavy winter rains, so it also had an environmental value to it too. Responding to the temperate climate, these interior courtyards, like we see in this one right here, and patios, they flowed from the house as outdoor living rooms. Today, it's in the upper 70s right now, and I'm far up. I'm 4 hours, north of Los Angeles, so it does have warm winters. Because of the lack of water, lawns would be very small and often located in these courtyards, rather than the typical front yard found for most of the United States at the time. This is a really beautiful photo that shows the lush landscape design at the entrance, where using the right plants for the right conditions would highlight how to design for a semi-arid climate. Palos Verdes was the largest unirrigated development in the country at the time, fulfilling that firm principle of water reducing design as an appropriate response to the Southern California climate. Instead of the English influence typical of most parks using large areas of lawns, Farnham Martins Park looked to Moorish design, a design from southern Spain, using a Mediterranean prototype. So in this park, it's terraced down the slopes. There's a large lawn here, and then 2 areas of hardscape that are clad in the Palos Verdes stone. The planting design that we see in this picture for certain on the edges of the park was intended to blend into the borrowed view, that borrowed landscape that's behind it, in color and in form, And then over here, it's showing a water tower. So continue to collect the water. Here are more examples of that lush, drought-tolerant design that even was brought into the commercial spaces, like we see here, that's minimized lawn use. Despite removing things like the lawn, we can see how that the entire community was designed, the business center, residential, parkways, playgrounds, open space, all responded to natural conditions. And then the Olmsted brothers connected all of these green spaces in what today we would call green infrastructure. The original allocation of open space has been maintained, and there's been some unexpected benefits that come of that. The Palos Verdes blue butterfly, and one of the most rare butterflies in the world, can be found here because its habitat is still intact. In addition to that in-depth research at Palos Verdes, the project benefited from the developer support and appreciation of California's native landscape. The Olmsted brothers had a client who was willing to showcase ecological urban design in water and land conservation, as well as plant choices using commercial and residential design. And through 90 years post-development, historic structures, parks, golf courses, and other amenities have been maintained. Another common landscape designed by the Olmsted brothers was roads. And while many of you might consider parkways a mundane type of landscape, the Olmsted brothers designed theirs, again, to have multifunction. In Southern California, the parkways would be designed to manage stormwater. The Olmsted firm, as you know, had a long history of designing pleasure drives, beginning in Central Park. And then for the Olmsted brothers, the Seattle Park and Parkway system is the most complete of their park and parkway designs. Like their father, they continued with the tradition of connecting existing green spaces to new parks with the parkways. So they would find those parks that were already there and then connect them into an overall system. While working at Palos Verdes in the 1920s, the Olmsted brothers were hired to design a series of parkways that would connect from the ocean at Palos Verdes, which is over here, to the new business district, which is way over here in Los Angeles. Sepulveda Highway, which is shown here, was an existing road that they would then incorporate into the Hollywood Palos Verdes plan. That's a north is actually to the right. So that's a north-south connecting road. And then they had an east-west connecting road right here called Sepulveda Parkway that crossed at this Avalon Park that's in the city of Gardena. Like in Palos Verdes, the design for the Hollywood Palos Verdes Parkway was also very wide at 200 to 400 feet. So this allowed to have 2 lanes of traffic in here. They also had 2 roads on either side for pedestrians or bikes. And then they placed service roads on this side, is where the trucks would drive. And then they pushed all these buildings back from the road because what they wanted was when you drove down these parkways to have a park-like experience while you were on them. The parkways, however, were very innovative in dealing with heavy rain in the winter. I keep emphasizing that, but you'll see how much this area floods when you get all of that rain in such a short amount of time. Since I had the copies of the planting plans and the grading plans for the Hollywood Palos Verdes Parkway system, my colleague Aaron Liggett modeled the unbuilt system to see whether the stormwater function would actually have worked. So modeled, there's one basin back here on the left. There's another one over here on the right that matches this area of the grading plan. And when he ran these models and put a 100-year flood event into them, the firm had made them the right depth to not flood. So the idea was for the roads to put the stormwater into these planted swales that were on the edges, and that's where the water would percolate. This is the design for Sepulveda Parkway. And there was a wide drainage channel that's between these lanes of parkways, between the 2 border roads. And then if we look at the typical cross section, we can see that the water is being placed in this kind of low ditch or swale in the channel. And that during large events, it did have an overflow. It had a way, that if it did fill up, you wouldn't be damaging, the pedestrian paths and motorway, bicycle route, service road, all of those before, it could harm any structures. But then they also planted trees, which we can see in the channel right here and along its edges, which would stabilize the banks and minimize erosion. The Olmsted brothers worked on designs for the Hollywood Palos Verdes Parkway up until 1930, when the firm was asked to design a park system for Los Angeles. And what they would do is they would link the Palos Verdes Parkway into that system. They'd already designed it, so it made sense that they would include them. Building off of their understanding of the climate, the parkways would not only conserve water, but connect the city along what at the time were its unchanneled rivers. So that park system for LA was one of the most ambitious park proposals developed by the firm because it was at a scale of 1,500 square miles. And the rivers in Los Angeles would play a major role. Their 1930 report was entitled Parks, Playgrounds, and Beaches for the Los Angeles Region, and was written in collaboration with the planning firm Bartholomew and Associates. And through my research, the language and the writing was actually by Frederick L. Olmsted Jr. In this drawing, the green here represents the proposed plan. We can see some of these larger parks like here, Elysian Park, ones that they would again incorporate existing parks into the new park and parkway system. And then the red parks that we see like Catalina Island or up in here were large areas, large reservations of open space that were in the mountains, canyons, deserts, and as I said, the island even of Catalina. One of the biggest challenges was that the rivers in Los Angeles were also unusual. Most park and river projects in other parts of the country dealt with the normal behavior of a river. That is that the river flows year-round and above ground. The park and parkway system design would also have to work with many watersheds, which we can see in this map here, how many watersheds are coming together from the Los Angeles watershed west to Santa Monica Bay. Here's Palos Verdes down in this area here. And that's the water then flows from the mountains to the ocean. So working with that river hydrology in this other map, we can see the different rivers coming together. There's the Rio Hondo, there's the Los Angeles River, San Gabriel River. All of these, as I said, were mostly unchanneled at the time, not in the concrete channels that we see today. To better understand the river's behavior, this cross-section provides a good example. So stormwater comes off of the San Gabriel Mountains in an uncontrolled flow, and then it gets down to this porous material and fills that with water. The water stays underground until there's enough that it's going to overflow, and then it comes out over here at Whittier Narrows, where today there's a dam in that location. In Los Angeles, both these images show normal river flow patterns. So one when the river on the left is flowing in the subterranean manner, and then when it overflows and floods, the water surfaces, as it does on the right-hand side, and caused a lot of damage. Both are near the same location, but only 1 year apart. Many newcomers to LA expected rivers that flowed above ground and would make the dangerous mistake of building in the floodplain. So that's what's going to happen to these people's house right here. The Olmsted plan was to move people to safety and to make these spaces flooded open space. As I said, a better use of those places that flood often was to allow for flooding. The lower San Gabriel River Parkway was a park with flood control design. And what Olmsted writes about in the proposal, he says, quote, "For a parkway, it would be far more attractive to preserve much of the character of the present bed, to develop border roads and dikes farther apart in a less formal manner, and make some uses of the land in the bed of the stream during most of the year when little or no water is running." So it would be left in these natural conditions because even if you see the Los Angeles River, there's usually no water in it or barely any water in it. The firm also researched the maximum width that the rivers needed for their natural flood patterns, and then they moved the roads to those edges. So we can see in here, when you're at the high points in the mountains, you have a narrower gauge where water's going to run. But as you get down to the mouth of the river, you need a much wider area for that river to flood. And we can see in these postcards here and the telltale signs of how wide that river has flooded at certain times. Within that report, Olmsted Jr. also compared the potential of Los Angeles to the Olmsted firm's built projects in places like Boston. So some parks could be used recreationally that would incorporate the rivers and their drainage problems into an aesthetic and useful design for active recreation. The Delray Marshes, which are near Marina Del Rey, which we see here, he offered, could be a waterside park, like Boston Back Bay's tidal marshes. Other parks would remain passive for things like hiking, habitat preservation, or seasonal use. And this was true where flooding occurred in places like Tahunga Wash. Other options for the land at the base of these mountains, which is those alluvial soils that I'm talking about, was to create sports fields. So those would be things that wouldn't be wrecked when it was totally flooded. The floodways were set apart so that they could also maximize, the maximum amount of flooding. And that way they would keep the normal hydrologic patterns in order and then percolate back into the soil. Another part of the LA Park plan was a design for Gardena Slough, which you can see and got circled over here in this area of the of Los Angeles. It was also a site where the Los Angeles River was too low in elevation to outlet to the ocean. So what happened is that a series of 3 lakes pooled together, known as the Watson Lakes. And so we can see that one of the examples over here on a set of drawings that Olmsted Jr. drew about this area. Maps from 1930 recorded the vast extent of flooding patterns in the slough, with that red outline showing the recommendation for a reservoir that was deep enough to hold back historic flooding of the area, which we can see in the blue outlines over here. And it typically, how much would flood. Because it was a marsh, this area was largely undeveloped, but the Olmsted brothers had a vision that would make it highly usable. So as this landscape was subject to very rare but heavy flooding, Olmsted Jr. noted that the design could be used for park purposes, even if it flooded. So to make it usable, the marsh would be deepened into a lake that would provide recreation with a boathouse, a bandstand, what he called meadow play fields that were located along the edges of the water, and that would be allowed to flood if needed. And then the park was bordered by these parkways, which we can see in here. Again, you can see how wide the parkways are. That protected the site from private development. So there's big spaces where the wiggle room that was needed to get people away from flooding. At the time, Olmsted Jr.'s concern was that the county flood control engineers had underestimated the flood levels in this area as well as other ones of low elevation. And he believed that during these maximum rain years, water levels would be probably 5 to 10 times what had been estimated by the engineers. The design for Gardena Slough would have mitigated for the flooding that happened in 1938, which is what we're seeing on this image here, where photos of it show Redondo Beach Boulevard buried underwater, which is in here, completely buried with flood water over the property, over housing, matching the same patterns as those historic maps. This disastrous flood that happened in 1938 not only killed a lot of people, but it caused $46 million of damage countywide because LA hadn't listened. Olmsted warned in his report not to channel the rivers, and he writes, if you can read with me, it's possible that a channel 10 to 12 feet deep and 300 to 400 feet wide may be needed eventually, especially in the lower reaches of the creek. Such a channel, if merely walled in, is likely to become a very ugly feature in the district, standing empty and dry most of the year, a receptacle for papers and rubbish. The channel can better be developed as a parkway. And so if you fly into Los Angeles, you can see here, these are the channeled rivers, channeled LA River, it's going near downtown. And, they actually channeled the rivers. But not to end on a sad note, let's talk about Olmsted's success stories in California. So while Los Angeles didn't follow the Olmsted brothers' advice to build a park system, the East Bay cities in Northern California did. So Olmsted was hired to write a management report for this open space, and written at the same time as the parks, playground, and beaches for the Los Angeles region. He proposed that the East Bay cities buy the ridgelines to prevent development and open them as recreational parks. He co-wrote his report with Chief Forester Ansel F. Hall. And in that report, Olmsted writes that the East Bay city communities face an unusual opportunity. Nature has placed within easy reach of this growing region a contiguous border of scenic land, most of which is too rugged for industrial or extensive residential purposes, but possessed of a highly recreational value. And while the East Bay district straddled 9 municipalities, Olmsted Jr. and Hall argued that the park reservations not follow jurisdictional boundaries, but ecological ones, and they called them topographical units, thinking really carefully about the environment. This was the view, this picture we see right here, the view of the bay from those East Bay lands. Like Los Angeles, the proposal incorporated picturesque water elements such as reservoirs and lakes and abandoned dams. and also shared much of the same language, arguing for the vital need for parks. These surplus watershed lands, or what they called water reservation areas, were preserved as a regional system of recreational parks that, for their costs, were left essentially in their open space, semi-arid conditions, with the exception of adding some carefully included roads and overlook points, such as at San Pablo Reservoir, as we see here. This arrow is pointing to, these are the original part of the lands that were purchased by the Olmsteds recommending to buy the ridgelines. That this larger area today, which extends significantly going south, includes Tilden Regional Park, which we see on top, and Wildcat Canyon, that photo below it. Located near one of the most dense areas of development in Oakland, the purchase of those ridge lines remains in public hands today. So we can see how beautiful both of these two landscapes have been conserved, but are acting as recreational use. And I might add, don't need a whole lot of additional irrigation. Lastly, like in Palos Verdes, Olmsted Jr. made plans for saving open space in all of California. He understood that relationship and balance of conservation and utilization of natural and constructed resources, from beaches to rivers to the connection of existing trails, connecting proposed open space. And for the Olmsted firm, they're really strategic in how they're going to plan for those. They wanted to protect ecosystems, fragile ecosystems, and in California to begin to think about mitigation for fire. You can thank Olmsted Jr. for California's state park system. Through legislation in 1927, there was an establishment of the California State Park Commission, and one of its first acts was to hire Frederick Olmsted Jr. to conduct a statewide survey to develop a list of areas to potentially become state parks. So he wrote in the report that the intent was to find lands that are suitable and desirable for a comprehensive, well-balanced park system, and that would conserve and utilize the scenic resources of the state. So what he did is he divided the state into 12 districts that are largely defined by topography, again, rather than jurisdictional boundaries. And without the use of GIS, which is mind-boggling to me, he studied the state as a landscape to make these recommendations. He submitted a list of 125 sites, such as Prairie Creek Redwood State Park in Northern California and Morro Bay State Park on the Central Coast. And this one is near where I live. Parklands would showcase a wide range of natural beauty in the state, from ocean, mountains, lakes, deserts. And the location of the state parks was such that every Californian was within a one-day's drive of a state park. So at the time, California was able to buy open space before it was developed to preserve or conserve these sites. Saving lands as state parks was one way of preserving invaluable landscapes, such as the ancient redwood forests of Northern California. Here we see the scale of this ancient tree, because here is the person right here. At the time, they were logging those redwoods and clear cutting for timber, even though the trees, some of them are 2,000 years old. Much of the coastline had been privatized by the 1920s, so Olmsted offered that perhaps within the mountainous regions, there could be prevention of that same kind of development by reserving these lands for public spaces. Strategic location of new roads into open space would solve two problems. One was that the roadways would get people in to see how beautiful the scenery is, allow for recreation, but those roads also provided access and mitigation as fire roads, which was something that's important in terms of today's climate. After all these years of work and thoughtful understanding of the region, the park and parkway system for Los Angeles was not built, nor were the innovative parkways in the Palos Verdes parkway system that managed stormwater. The firm's prescient design approach to the semi-arid region in Southern California has only recently been reconsidered, like say the last 20 years, kind of rethinking how to work with the region's challenging hydrology. Without the park and parkway system, LA has about the least amount of equitable access to green space for a major metropolis by not setting these lands aside from development. So in the 1930s, the Depression had slowed new construction. For California, it really starts in about 1932. And so Olmsted Jr. returns to the office in Brookline. But when he retires, he and his wife, Sarah, moved to Palo Alto, California to be near their daughter, Charlotte, and her 4 children who were living in the San Francisco area. And then because of Olmsted's lifelong work in California, especially regarding conservation of the natural beauty of the state, a grove was dedicated to him at the state park that he included in that 1930 report, which was Prairie Creek Redwoods State Park. And he was 83 years old. Frederick Olmsted and his wife, Sarah, moved closer to the ocean in Malibu, as Sarah missed the ocean from her time in Palos Verdes. And here, Olmsted died in 1957 in a beautiful place that he loved.
Wow.
So thank you very much.
Thank you, Christy. That was just fascinating. I mean, I'm struck that what's old is new again. I mean, you have pointed out that looking at their use of planting in semi-arid environment and some of their planting efforts have been reinvestigated in the last 20 years. And I think, frankly, that's largely been you. So we want to give you credit for doing that. It's amazing to see how, as you say, how prescient they were in terms of thinking about resilience and sustainability. And I don't know that they would have used those words, but certainly they were really on the cutting edge of thinking about these things in a way that is even more valuable today. So, I mean, I'd like to ask first, and then I urge more questions in the chat box. So LA obviously did not take the plan. Is it easy or relatively easy to explain why they did not embrace the plan that was presented to them?
There were several issues. If you look at the report, Olmsted locates where the placement of all of these parkways would go, which are mostly through private property. And so, while the East Coast might have a better kind of idea for the common cause of everybody doing these, West Coast is much more individualistic. And so people had, the right to do what they want with their own land. So the eminent domain issues were huge. Also, I think they were myopic when they heard the price tag, $50 million, but it was going to be spread over many, many years of developing this. And when I looked at later research of the flooding that LA had to mitigate, they paid as much in mitigation costs as it would have been to build this. So they thought that the cost was too high, plus the restrictions on, taking people's land.
People want to see you, Christy, so they're hoping you'll quit sharing your screen so that they can see you in a fuller form. Great. Let me ask another question. So native and non-native, that obviously is a major debate today. And I'd like your thoughts as to how the Olmsted brothers looked at natives and non-natives in their work in California.
They weren't nativists at all in sort of using only those plants. When you look at some of the plants that were going to be planted even in those bioswales, there's things like ivy that's in them. What they were wanting to do was to find that balance of what things would succeed. So clearly, if you look at Palos Verdes before they started development, it was former ranch land. So it's mostly grassland at that point from pasturing. But they were replanting all those slopes. And so it's finding natives and things that are going to exist without irrigation that they would then have to have kind of restore those slopes, with those plantings. That said, they still had a lot of perennials and things like that in the residential designs. So it was balanced. I think they tried to balance not using too much water and also having a more regional palette. The plant palette where we live is not a Kelly green because of the lack of water. It's an olive or it's a gray. And those kind of leaves tend to be like lavender, tend to be plants that are more drought tolerant. Matches maybe the natural landscape better too.
Here's a great question from Jacksonville. So would the Olmsted brothers find the areas and suggest to the municipalities to protect them, or would the municipalities come to them and say, we're interested in your view as to what we might protect?
I would say more often they offered to protect things that weren't asked for. I didn't talk about Boulder, but when Olmsted Jr. did a report for the city of Boulder, Colorado in 1910, they wanted them to deal with Boulder Creek. It was flooding. They wanted to know how to better create a city beautiful plan. But what he did in terms of what they asked him, he did what he was asked to do, but what he offered that was outside of his scope was for them to buy the view shed, to tax themselves, buy the view shed. And so if you come out of Denver, you'll go through this whole area that's cheap by jowl development. And then as you drive down into Boulder, you'll see all of the hills are still largely undeveloped. So it more often than not, I think the Olmsted firm was looking ahead at what wasn't asked of them to think, better ahead what's important. Clearly, the state parks, that was an ask, like choose which ones these lands should be set aside. And he prioritized ones that were invaluable, like the redwoods, save those now, because otherwise all those historic trees are going to be gone. So it's kind of a combination.
Here's a question. What about eucalyptus? We know there's a lot of eucalyptus, I think in the East Bay. Were these planted at their request? Apparently they're now failing and they're also flammable. So talk a little bit about that plant selection.
The Olmsted brothers did propagate them, thousands and thousands of them. When the land was bought, it was a former ranch, and eucalyptus had been used as property lines. So when you see the entrance to Palos Verdes, this kind of landscaped entrance, they cut through the existing eucalyptus, but they did plant more. And I'm not really sure why they didn't know more about this particular plant, given that they had, direction from other very knowledgeable horticulturists. It still is an issue. It's still an issue in Palos Verdes where people don't want them blocking their views. And it's a tree too, that if you water it in the summer, it's from Australia or New Zealand, I think Australia. If you water it in the summer, its limbs fall off. It kind of weakens the tree. So it ends up becoming this more dangerous tree to put in a lot of locations. I don't know if I quite answered that, but they use it anyways.
Well, we know buckthorn, we know Phragmites, so there are other places where plants we now disfavor were part of the planting plan. So a continuing challenge. Here's a question. How did the brothers decide what projects to work on?
I think they took everything from what I read. They've got 200 consults for California. Some of them were only an initial meeting. Sometimes their bid was too expensive. For Palos Verdes, John Charles didn't think it would actually amount to much. I think he sends Dawson to the meeting to see what they wanted. And here it ends becoming this, 30-year project that they work on. So looking at the scale, the California projects, they're doing like a memorial at a hospital to watershed planning plans. So, the whole scope, I think they took most everything from what I can tell.
Here's a question about whether or not Ian McHarg was familiar with the Olmsted brothers' work. Alan Oberts notes parallels between Palos Verdes and the woodlands in Texas. And he's curious about the interaction or relationship in these two practices.
I do not know that answer, but what I did write about in my dissertation was that Olmsted's categorization list of selecting state parks was very similar to the same characteristics that Ian McHarg used later in the 1960s in terms of looking at both qualitative and quantitative value of these landscapes. And he had a tabulation system that I don't know if McHarg ever saw it, but they're part and parcel of the same thing of what they're trying to make judgments, qualitative judgments between different landscapes of which would be the right one to keep or have a priority of keeping. But it'd be interesting to know. I don't know enough about McHarg's biography to know whether, obviously the Olmsted firm did this kind of overlay planning. Warren Manning did it, early in Birmingham. Charles Elliott did it before him. So there's elements of the Olmsted firm is kind of thinking through different ways to better understand that landscape before any kind of design intervention begins. But that's a good question. I'll follow up on it later.
Do we have other questions? John Olmsted, a good name, is asking, the name Olmsted was misspelled regarding a small museum on the point described. He's just curious, was that ever corrected?
Is this the one in Yosemite? Or which one is he talking about?
I'm not sure. John, if you can elaborate which one you're talking about. We certainly can say at the Olmsted Network that we see Olmsted spelled in a variety of ways
Yes.
everywhere.
Does John say where the museum's located?
It says a small museum on the point that described the Olmsted plan. Perhaps he'll elaborate. Oh, here we go. Area just south of Palos Verdes was badly eroded.
I do not know, but I sure hope so. They've had two National Register nominations come out of Palos Verdes in the last few years. One of them from Malaga Cove Plaza, which is the first commercial district that you did with. And then another one for this Merlot Tower coming in on another section of Palos Verdes that they're trying to preserve. But I'll have to go look for that sign because I'm not sure. Hopefully not. That's embarrassing.
And is it true that Frederick Law Olmsted Jr.'s home in Palos Verdes was razed because of erosion near the home?
The erosion was caused by a major earthquake in Long Beach. So part of the land fell off. As you can see, some of the before and after, there's cribbing that was applied to that slope. He is pretty close. You know, he was, I don't know, 20 feet from the edge. So very, very close. The landscape falls off in the earthquake. He keeps that, you know, puts that retaining wall in there to hold it because he'd already sold the property by that point. But later there were cracks, I think, still left from that original earthquake, so that I think there might have been one standing wall left from its initial design, which is unfortunate. So it was one of only two buildings that Myron Hunt designed at Palos Verdes, and Olmsted's home was one.
Wow. Well, this has been an absolutely fantastic presentation. As you can see, you have elicited lots of inquiries from our audience, and I am happy to remind everyone that the presentation was recorded and will be posted to YouTube, so you can go back and re-listen and reacquaint with the various points made today by Dr. O'Hara. We are so thankful that you joined us today to kick off our 2024 programming year. And I want to just remind everyone that we will have a series of programs. And our next one, February 20th, it will be our first conversation with Olmsted. The American Society of Landscape Architects turns 125 this year. And as we all know, the Olmsted brothers were instrumental in the founding of the ASLA. So we will be hosting this program exploring the future of landscape architecture. We have some real rock stars. Kate Orff, Tori Carter-Canine, and Thomas Woltz, the landscape architect, will be with us that day to discuss the future of landscape architecture, again, February 20th at 3 p.m. You can find out more about it on our website. John King, the cultural critic for the San Francisco Chronicle, will be the moderator. And then again in March 24, we'll be zeroing in to Shelburne Farms in Vermont to take a look at that prized Olmsted landscape. So lots ahead, with thanks again to Dr. O'Hara for an absolutely fantastic and provocative presentation. We look forward to seeing all of you again soon, and want you to have a wonderful rest of the day. Thanks again. We'll see you soon.